Hey everyone, I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast. The book is When the Irish Invaded Canada. The author, Christopher Kline. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us for a second time on the Irish Baseball Podcast.
It's great to talk to you again, Rick. Appreciate it.
So, we talked about your book before on the podcast, and it was in the very, very beginning of everything we've been doing. And now, with the 250th anniversary of the United States, we've been trying to highlight the impact that Irish Americans and Irish immigrants have had on the country in the 250 years, which made me want to revisit your book because this is such an interesting moment in American history and I guess Canadian history as well. But I don't think a lot of people know it. So the first thing I want to discuss is just what happened when the Irish invaded Canada.
Well, I mean, it was certainly a far-fetched story. You have a group of Irish immigrants who fled the Great Hunger in Ireland, come to the United States, fight on both sides of the Civil War, and then form their own private army with the idea of invading Canada and, in essence, ransoming Canada for Ireland's independence from Britain. Uh, Needless to say, the plan did not work, um, but but neither was it. It's often portrayed as I used to say this sounded like a completely crazy idea, having anyone from America like going up to Canada, try to take it over, to be state and it's somehow come back to being not as far-fetched as it has had been. But still, United States and Canada share this longest usable international border in the world. So the idea sounds completely far-fetched. But what I try to do with the book is try to take everyone back to 1865. And there's a couple things going on. One is this idea of Americans invading Canada is about as American as hot dogs on the 4th of July. It's something that had happened numerous times in the first American century. And the other is that Canada at the time was a colony of Great Britain, just like Ireland was. And there's a lot of animosity after the Civil War in America to Great Britain because in essence, its neutrality had sided with the Confederacy, and Confederate warships had been built in Liverpool and other British ports. And Canada was also where the Confederate Secret Service had operated from and had launched a raid on a bank in St. Albans, Vermont, and undertook a firebombing of theaters in New York City in 1864 and was suspected of being involved in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So there's just a lot of there's a lot of backstory to this that I wanted to talk about to make it sound as not as crazy as it sounds to us today about um, why this band of Irish immigrants were undertaking this attack on Canada.
And you mentioned it was a lot of Civil War veterans from both sides of the conflict, but a lot of the animosity was because England, for all intents and purposes, supported the Confederacy. They couldn't do it outright because they had already banned slavery in the British Empire, and there was some politics about that. But this was a group of men who were trained, they were well trained, they knew how to fight battles and win battles. So, yes, it was a crazy idea in many ways, and it was far fetched and had very little chance of succeeding. But you weren't dealing with people who were novices to fighting. So, who were some of the major leaders of this movement?
So this movement is undertaken by a group that's called the Fenian Brotherhood, and it's founded in the United States in 1858. And it's a sister organization to a group called the Irish Republican Brotherhood that was founded in Dublin in 1858 as well. And the IRB is actually, you can draw a through line from the IRB to the IRA that we know in modern times, and certainly the IRA that was fighting in the War of Irish Independence. Um, the leaders of the organization were Irish immigrants. A lot of them were involved in the failed Young Ireland Rebellion in 1848. And originally, the idea was they were going to form this organization in the United States, the Fenian Brotherhood, where they're going to raise money, buy weapons, and they were going to ship them to the IRB to launch another revolution in Ireland. But after the British cracked down on the IRB in Ireland, there really was this growing thought among the Fenians in the United States that the better way to go is instead of trying to launch a revolution, a transatlantic revolution, and a revolution in Ireland has been repeatedly failed over the recent decades. Why don't we strike the British Empire at their closest spot to us? And that was going to be up in Canada. And so the original founder of the Fenian Brotherhood, his name was John O'Mahony, and he had always wanted to stay the course of the original plan of let's have this invasion, uh, let's have this revolution in Ireland. But in those months after the Civil War, you had a lot of those Irishmen who had come to America, and the reason that a lot of them served in the Civil War was really twofold. One was they're still at the bottom of the economic ladder. So, the few $100s that they can get for enlisting in the Union Army is money that they needed. So they figure, all right, it's going to be worth, the enlistment. We'll get the money, and then we'll also learn about military tactics and weapons, and that we can then use to really fight that battle that they are still longing to have, and that's the one against the British. And that's the thing I think in doing the research in the book, it really is amazing to me. You have a lot of these men who were here, they came over in the late 1840s, had been in America for nearly 20 years, fought in the Civil War, but a lot of them still, they still had that longing for their homeland. They viewed themselves as exiles from Ireland, and they never let go of really that longing to have that battle against the British and try to overthrow the British rule in Ireland. And so it's this group that in 1866 really starts gaining the momentum inside the organization. And there's a man named Thomas William Sweeney who puts together the battle plan, a five-pronged invasion of Canada. And to me, Thomas William Sweeney really is the epitome of the fighting Irish. He comes over to America when he's a child. He's actually swept overboard, crossing the Atlantic, spends about a half hour in the cold Atlantic before he's rescued, but he still survives. He will fight in the Mexican-American War, end up losing one of his arms in battle, still remains part of the U.S. military, gets into a fist fight with a superior officer, manages to whip him with his one good arm. And then in the Civil War, he fights in the Battle of Shiloh, really known for his heroics there, despite three more gunshots that he undertook. But even through all that, after the end of the Civil War, he becomes the Secretary of War for the Fenian Brotherhood and devises this battle plan to invade Canada. And so it's really his brainchild is this planned invasion that they're going to launch in the spring of 1866.
And the actual fighting does not take place in New York City, but New York City plays a big part in the planning of this. And that was something that in our first conversation we really didn't get into that much. But there has been not just with when the Irish invaded Canada, but throughout the history of Ireland trying to gain its independence, that New York has played a central role in that fight.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, if anyone's sort of familiar today with Union Square in Manhattan, um, if you know Union Square, and there's a Barnes and Noble on the north side of Union Square. And back in 1866, right near that location was a brownstone that was the capital of the Irish Republic in exile. That was the headquarters of the Fenian Brotherhood. So they had, in 1866, they had tens of thousands of members in the Fenian Brotherhood, and they would stage fundraisers across the country, but particularly in New York, they had these tremendous fundraisers where they'd have these Irish picnics, and tens of thousands of people would attend, and they would raise money for the cause of having the revolution in Ireland. They sold bonds, war bonds that you could pay. I think they sold them from like $10 to $500. So you could buy these war bonds, and you would be repaid within 6 months of the establishment of the Irish Republic once the revolution had been achieved. Which was a funny side note that when finally the Irish Republic was established in the 1920s, all of a sudden these people back in America had these war bonds that they had hidden away in their drawers that they were looking to get paid back from the Irish government. Had no idea where these were coming from. So they didn't pay them, but you can still, if you go on eBay, you'll still see that they get $500,000 that they'll sell for. These bonds are still lurking out there today. Uh, but with that money, they buy, they get this space in the brownstone, this opulent brownstone where they have the president of the Fenian Brotherhood is there, the cabinet meets there. It's this entire operation. There's a flagpole, and on the top of it's waving a green flag with the Irish harp on it. Um, and so it really is the headquarters of the Irish Republic in exile, and it's right there in New York City. You, of course, have a lot of at the dawn of the media age there, you have a lot of newspapers that are covering the Fenian Brotherhood, so they're getting a lot of press coverage, and you have, Irish American newspapers that are popping up as well that are being used to sort of rally people to the cause. So yeah, New York plays a very big role in funding this operation, and where's really the plan is hatched.
So, in the early 20th century, when the Irish set up the Irish Republican government, it was by going through British elections, getting MPs elected, and then they didn't take their seat. Instead, they took their seat in the Dáil. How did the members of the Fenian Brotherhood, was there a way that they sort of showed their legitimacy? Were there any sort of elections? Was it elections in the group? Or how did somebody become the president of the Fenian Brotherhood?
Yeah. So it was really, you had in its early years, John O'Mahony was the founder of the organization. He was, the leader of the organization for its, about first 8 years, and certainly through the Civil War. And what happened is that, um, the membership really takes off during the Civil War, and the group they'll form what they call circles. These would be your local organization. And you had members then that would elect the head of the circle, and then eventually, in I think 1863 might be the first year that they actually then have a national convention, with the leaders of the different circles who go to, I believe in Chicago is where they first have the convention. And by this point, the Fenian Brotherhood is actually gaining as enough legitimacy that recruiting was going on inside the Civil War camps. So you would have recruiters who would go from camp to camp and try to enlist members to sign up and give money to the Fenian Brotherhood. But the organization was gaining legitimacy enough that soldiers were actually able to get passes to go to Chicago to be a part of this convention. So you have in those ensuing years, you start getting these annual meetings of the Fenians where they would elect their board members, they'd you know um, give their approval to the president or not. So it is this sort of bottom up organization that also then is slightly has this paramilitary tinge where, they want to be able to sort of move this operation then out on the battlefield. And, in some ways they want to have a chain where um, initially when it's formed as a secret organization. Um, so they didn't want one member to actually know who the other members around the country were going to be to give them some sort of, chain of control over the information. So it's this secrecy that supposedly being set up as a secret organization when it starts in 1858, which is kind of ironic that members will end up getting excommunicated from the Catholic Church because they weren't allowed to take secret oaths to another organization. But the great irony is going to be that the Fenians are far from good at keeping any sort of secrets and are very easily infiltrated by spies and freely use their Irish gift of gab. So there really aren't any secrets that are being kept by the Fenians. But basically, once it starts growing, it sort of abandons that secrecy and then moves more to this membership base and forming these different circles and meeting in these annual conventions around the country.
And was the goal to take over parts of Canada, exchange it for Irish independence, and then the Fenian Brotherhood move back and be a part of the Irish government? Or was this to just establish Irish independence and then have these men stay in the United States?
So there's a few different rationales about what they're hoping to do when they attack Canada. And certainly the most optimistic and most radical of them believed that they could launch an invasion of Canada. They expected, and this is a theme that will pop up a lot in American history, they expected to be greeted as liberators. They thought that all the Irish who had immigrated to Canada, the French speakers in Quebec, would certainly want to join up with them, overthrow British rule in Canada. Um, and they thought that they would be able to take possession of Canada and basically swap it out, give it back to the British as long as the British left Ireland. That's really a minority view. And really, what some of them are hoping to do is what they might be able to do is let's get a little piece of Canadian territory. And from that, we can then sort of gain the international right to launch under international law, launch privateers to go and disrupt the British. Um, Another thought is that will cause so much chaos in Britain that, or so much chaos in Canada that the British are going to have to shift troops from Ireland to Canada. That's going to leave Ireland much more vulnerable to an Irish revolution. Maybe the most realistic option that they are thinking of here, though, is that they know there's this animosity in the United States towards Great Britain. They know that the United States has acquired territories in the West and in the Southwest after the war with Mexico in 1848. They've reunited the country after the Civil War. What's the next place in Manifest Destiny that they want to go seize territory? The natural place is going to be in Canada. And there's even a proposal in 65 or 1866, a bill is introduced into Congress that delineates where four new states will be taken from Canada and where 29 new representatives will be apportioned from as well. So the most realistic idea of why to launch the invasion really is let's get across into Canada, have some success, and then the United States will more or less follow our lead in, take, you know, join forces with us. With their power, they can certainly overrun Canada. And what the United States would wants to have is territory in Canada, and they also have millions of dollars in reparations that they want the British government to pay them for all the damage that was done by Confederate warships that were seizing Union ships all around the world during the time of the Civil War. So it's really trying to spark this war with the United States and Great Britain, and then more or less have the United States thanking them by using them as leverage to get the British out of Ireland. It's really the most realistic option that they have at that point. But there are certainly radical thoughts among some of the members who think that they're going to go in with a private army and overrun Canada.
And you mentioned how they were hoping to create disunity. They were hoping that the French Catholics in Quebec, the Irish who are all over Canada, there was a huge Irish immigration to Canada as well, that they would join them and create disunity among the Canadian people. And actually, what they ended up doing was the exact opposite. And the thought of Canada as its own country kind of comes out of this moment in history.
Yeah. So what's also going on in Canada at this time is, you have a few of these British colonies, but there's this growing movement in Canada for what they call confederation to try to have their own Canadian Parliament that can rule over Canadian matters, so there's not as this direct rule from London. And so this is operating in the background on the Canadian side. Um, and we might talk about this a little bit later, but the Fenians will launch an attack from Buffalo on June 1st, 1866, and there is a battle in which 20 or so men die. Some of them Canadian militiamen, some of them students at the University of Toronto. And it is a victory for the Fenians. And so they are waging battles in Canada for, they're in Canada for a good 48 hours before they ultimately retreat. But in the wake of this, it really gives this shot to Canadian nationalism and this move to Confederation because, in large part, the Canadians see that the British government really gave them very little defense, no defense at all from this attack across the southern border. And in the wake of the Fenian raids, is what they're called in Canada, um, there's a lot of support then for Confederation, and a Canadian Parliament is established in on July 1st, 1867. So barely a year after this Irish invasion, you get Canada as still a British Dominion, but it has this self-rule through the Canadian Parliament that is established in Ottawa. And at that time, Ottawa is really just this real small sort of lumber town, not anywhere near the size of Toronto or Montreal. But the reason the capital ends up in this lumber town is because it's not it's just further away from the American border, and they want to make sure that the Canadian capital is not going to be as close to any sort of invasion, whether it comes from American citizens or whether it comes from the American government, and that's why it's placed there.
While all this is happening, the US government is dealing with a ton. There's reconstruction trying to bring the former states of the Confederacy back into the United States. There's an impeachment of President Johnson. There is trying to get reparations from the British for these ships that were taken. All of this is happening with the United States government. I can't imagine that they were happy with this ragtag group of former Civil War vets who are going and invading Canada, because even if the United States did want Canada, they did not end up supporting the Irish in their efforts, even when they did get some Canadian territory. So I can't imagine that the federal government was very happy about this.
Not in the immediate aftermath, and that came as a surprise to the Fenian army, because in the lead up to this, there is there's a meeting at the White House between some of the Fenian leaders and with President Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, in which they sort of allude to the idea of, we might be, interested in invading Canada, and we know that the United States has its own issues with Canada and Great Britain, and this all the whole idea of any sort of private Americans launching a war against a foreign nation is completely in violation of any sort of American neutrality laws. So, they're sort of alluding to this idea, and during the course of the conversation, Johnson, according to the Fenians, basically says that he will acknowledge, he's not going to give him any sort of support, but he will, quote unquote, acknowledge accomplished facts. So that if he wakes up someday and the Fenians are in Canada, he's not going to do anything that's going to necessarily stand in their way, because there is this other benefit that they want to have, in terms of using the Fenians more or less to do the work that they are interested in doing in Canada. Um, so when the Fenians invade, they fully expect that they're going to be able to get reinforcements flooding over the line. And then after they launch their attack in June of 1866, and um, there's this battle, the Battle of Ridgeway, that's about 15 miles west of Ontario, west of Buffalo, in which the Fenians are successful. Um, they circle back and find that their supply lines have been cut by the American government. They think they've been completely double crossed by Andrew Johnson. And so Johnson doesn't really, not surprisingly, Johnson, not one of our finest American presidents, didn't necessarily know the best way to handle the situation. Basically lets the Fenians linger. He captures all of them, 800 of them, as they try to come back to the United States territory, keep them on a barge in the middle of the Niagara River for 48 hours for finally decides, all right, what we're going to do is basically we're just going to pay everyone's train fare to just go back home. Um, they arrest the ringleaders, um, have them in jail, they get out on bail. Eventually they just drop all the charges against them and more or less just want to try to have this whole thing go away. And um, the Fenians try to launch a small little invasion subsequently from Vermont in the ensuing days that sort of ends. But um, the Fenian Brotherhood does not go away and will again launch these increasingly futile and sometimes farcical campaigns in 1871. But once the United States gets their reparations from Great Britain, signs a peace treaty with Great Britain, they more or less have no longer need for the Fijians to sort of help them with leverage to get what they want as far as the payments from the British government. Um, and more or less, that's sort of the start of that special relationship between the United States and Great Britain, that sort of carries over into world wars after that. And there certainly are a lot of Fenians who thought they were sold down the Niagara River after their invasion.
Well, that is a really good point that you bring up because when we talk about the 250th anniversary of the United States and we think the whole country started with a rebellion against the British, and then there was the War of 1812, and then you have the Civil War where there was at least tacit support from the British for the Confederacy. When we think about the last 100 years or so, and this very close relationship between the US and the British, that was not the case when the Irish first started coming over here in the famine years. And I think one of the reasons that the Irish were able to have such an impact on what eventually became Irish independence is that the US government wasn't necessarily all that interested in stopping them from planning these things. And then, especially with the advent of World War One, and then we needed to have this special relationship with Britain during that. And then, of course, World War Two, it got even stronger. But looking at it through today's goggles, it must seem ridiculous for people to think that the US would support anybody trying to fight or break away from Great Britain, but that was not the case back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, what I hope to do with the book. I mean, there have been a number of books that have been written about the Fenian raids from the Canadian perspective. What I really wanted to do was to try to tell this story from the perspective of the Irish, um, just to and to try to put it in the context, to try to understand that oftentimes this is just dismissed as like, there's just a bunch of drunken Irishmen, who just went across, from Buffalo after a few whiskeys and tried to, knock the British around. No, this is a chapter in a long hundreds of years struggle for Irish independence that gets transplanted to the United States, um, after the failure of the potato crop. And this this desire, this fire to try to liberate their homeland does not end when they come to the United States. And in fact, in many ways, burns a lot hotter here because when they come to the United States, there's a lot of blowback against their presence in America. I mean, you have they're newcomers unlike the country had ever seen. They're not necessarily immigrants, they're more refugees. They're fleeing from hunger. They're not coming to America necessarily starving for its ideas. They're literally starving for food. And a quarter of them speak a foreign language. They're speaking Irish. And what really sets them apart is that most of them are Catholic, which is a completely foreign religion to many people in the country. And so there's a lot of at this time you get the rise of nativism and the know nothings, and so the Irish really, in a way, coil themselves like a snake for protection, really turn inward and really, sort of steer into their Irish identity in a way that happens here more so than you actually see among the Irish who end up settling in Canada, and is part of the reason why when the Fenians invade Canada, they don't necessarily get that support that they were expecting from, because that Irish nationalism doesn't really ignite as much in Canada as it did in the United States during during that time. So that's really what I want to do, is try to like put this in context that it sounds completely crazy to us today, but back in 1865, it really, in a way, fits into um, this long Irish history and also this first 100 years of American history and its relations with Canada and Great Britain.
Before the Civil War, a lot of Americans would refer to themselves by their state. They would say, I'm a Pennsylvanian, I'm a Virginian, I'm a Massachusetts man. But after the Civil War, that is when the idea of the United States of America, obviously, it had been a country for almost 100 years, but that's really when the idea of people calling themselves an American comes. That's when that starts, because before that, like I said, it was way more being defined by your state or by your area. And it's almost ironic that the Civil War takes most Americans and makes them more American. And it feels like a lot of these Irish immigrants and Irish Americans who fought in the Civil War, it kind of solidified their Irishness. And even people who were on completely opposite sides during the Civil War were able to get together for this Irish cause. It is such an interesting moment in history. And I think that one of the things that I like the most about your book is it highlights the importance of the United States in Irish independence. This chapter didn't end up leading to Irish independence, but there was funding, there was great political pressure. The United States is very much a part of the story of Irish independence. And I guess I could get a little more of your thoughts on that, except for we are running out of time. So, Christopher Kline, I want to thank you so much for being here. Anybody who has not read this book, When the Irish Invaded Canada, pick it up right now for the 250th anniversary of the United States. I think it is a really important book to read for any Irish American. Christopher Kline, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, that's a great conversation. I appreciate it.